Good evening. So I'm straying a bit from what I said I would preach about last week. As we know, it's the second Sunday, so the sermons in the evening are shorter, and I just didn't think I could do Second Thessalonians 2 justice with a kind of a time constraint. Not that this is a rush job or anything like that. It's just something that there's a lot to say in kind of a few words. So you don't need to raise your hand and answer this, but just think about it in your head. When's the last time you cried? When was the last time you cried? What was it about? Could anything stop it? Was it uncontrollable? Was it a tiny little crying to yourself? What was it? Growing up, how many of us were told that boys don't cry? Told that, well, it's not manly to cry. Well, yes, it is. It's manly to be good enough to show your emotions, to be able to express them. There's not a thing wrong with crying. And you know how I know this? Because Jesus wept. Turn with me to John chapter 11. We'll be in John chapter 11 tonight. There's so much in this story. There's so much even in those two little words. In verse 35, Jesus wept. So we're just going to take a short look at that. And hopefully you know this now. But if you don't, hopefully by the end you will know it is okay to cry. It is an emotion that God gave us. It is something that is built into us when there's something sad, if we're overwhelmed, a various number of reasons. It is okay to cry. So what is happening here in John chapter 11? Well, it starts out in verse 1 saying, "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, a village of Mary and her sister Martha." So we kind of set the scene. We know who we're going to be talking about, Lazarus who was sick. And then we've also got the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And in verse 3, they go to Jesus. Verse 2, they went to Jesus. They had wiped his feet with their hair, and it was their brother Lazarus who was sick. So in verse 3, they go to him and say, "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." So we have a little backstory here. Lazarus is somebody that Jesus knows already. He is somebody that Jesus cares about enough that they say, "This person that you love is sick." So, verse 4, when Jesus heard this, he said, "The sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it." I don't know about you, but if I heard that, that would be pretty comforting. Saying, it's not going to end in death, it'll be for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. That sounds really good. So I think it was probably a little bit surprising and upsetting to Mary and Martha when what happened? Lazarus died. They heard Jesus say this, and they heard what they thought he meant, but they didn't completely understand exactly what he meant, how he meant it. Verse 5, it continues telling us who Jesus loved. It says, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So this is a family that he is close to enough to love them. He loves all of them. He stayed 2 days longer after he had heard that he was sick, and then he goes with his disciples to Judea, there in verse 7. So if you go to verse 11, it says, "This he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of his sleep." So there is a plan from the very beginning. Jesus knew what he was going to do, even back in verse 4 when he says the sickness will not end in death. He knew what the final result would be. So he says, I will wake him up. I will help him from his sleep. Verse 13, now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. Again, kind of another example of the disciples. not quite understanding exactly what Jesus was talking about. They've been around Jesus long enough. You would think they'd start to get it, but we know through multiple interactions and stuff, they don't always understand what he's saying. So they think that he actually just fell asleep and Jesus is going to go there and wake him up. Well, he is, but it's a little more intense than that. So verse 14, he explains it, clear, plain speech, and says, Lazarus is dead. There's no way to misinterpret that. There's no way to misunderstand that. But he tells them that Lazarus is dead. Verse 15, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So he's happy that he wasn't there so that he could give them an opportunity to believe. We know that when Jesus performed miracles, that he did it not only to show his power, but it also helped people believe, that they understood what he was saying and that the things that he was saying were true because he could back them up. He could practice what he preached. He could show them his divinity and the knowledge and the power that he had. So verse 17 said, when Jesus came, he found that he had already been dead in the tomb for 4 days. I know that we've discussed this before, but that is very significant. I don't know the exact time, but a body starts decomposing pretty quickly. But if a body's been dead for 4 days, it's really dead. There's no, well, we thought he was dead and he wasn't, and he could have come back to life, or he was in a really deep sleep, or he was in a coma. 4 days, they knew he was dead. There was no doubt from that, and that makes what Jesus does all the more powerful, all the more amazing for what he is able to accomplish here at the end of the story. It talks about the location. It says Bethany, verse 18, was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So she says a very true statement here, and one that is very telling in her belief in Jesus. It says, if you were here, he would not have died. That's not doubting Jesus' power. That's actually praising, saying, you could have done this if you were here. And even if he wasn't there, I think that she would believe that he could take care of Lazarus. But she says, if you were here, my brother would not have died. But Jesus comforts her in verse 23, saying, your brother will rise again. But she thinks he's talking about the resurrection. So again, not fully understanding what exactly Jesus is getting ready to do in this instance, saying that your brother will rise again. If we skip down to verse 28, it says, she went away and called to Mary, her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now, verse 30 is really important. Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. There were people that had come to comfort Mary and Martha. They had just lost their brother. Just like we do today, we want to comfort people. We want to talk them, to console them, see if there's anything we can do to help. But these people may not have seen Jesus yet, because it defines that Jesus had not yet come into the village, so we know that he wasn't there, but he was in the place where Martha had met him. And we're told that in verse 31, then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to weep there. Verse 32, therefore when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's the same thing that her sister said, same understanding that she had, saying, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Verse 33, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Now before we get to verse 35, we're going to hold on right there. So when he heard about Lazarus, he knows that he has died. Both of the sisters come out to meet him. They both say, if you had been here, you could have made him better. He would not have died if you had been here. Jesus was explaining he will live again, them not quite understanding that he's not talking about the resurrection. But where he starts to show his emotion is when he sees the people. Verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, talking about Mary here, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. When we see sad things on our own, it can make us emotional. It can make us cry. It can make us just not quite know what to do. That is almost multiplied when we see other people reacting the same way. If you see somebody crying about something that had happened, at least this is my experience, you start feeling those emotions too. And you might be able to hold them in and hide them if you want to, if you're by yourself. But if you see other people doing it, it makes it that much harder. But Jesus here, once he saw Mary and all the Jews there weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. Remember, we know how much he loves his family. It says that he loved Lazarus, he loved Mary, and he loved Martha. So he is very close to them, and he is sad even though he knows exactly what he is about to do. So in the in the King James version, when they talk about them crying, it says, verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping. This word weeping is used 40 times in the King James version, this version of that word, and it defines it as to sob, that is to wail aloud, or to bewail or weep. So something that's very, I will say animated. You're not holding it in, you're not trying to hold it in, you're just letting it all go. So that is what Mary and the Jews are doing. They were openly weeping, they were sobbing and wailing aloud. So verse 35, right after he said, "Where have you laid him?" and they said to him, "Lord, come here and see." Verse 35 says Jesus wept. That word wept, that translates, I'm terrible with Greek, but dakru, we'll go with that. That's used one time in the King James. It's used one time, and it is here. And it is defined as to shed tears. A commentary that I read said it's more of a personal, not an outward expression of it. But Jesus was saddened. He was moved. We know that he was moved in spirit and he was troubled. But Jesus wept. He did not cry in the same way that those around him did, those that were around him that he saw, that caused him that trouble and being moved in spirit. But Jesus still felt that emotion necessary to cry for the loss of Lazarus. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He knew that he was going to raise him from the dead, yet he still felt that compassion, that love for him and the family, and Jesus wept. So there's a difference there between what Mary and the Jews were weeping and Jesus weeping kind of silently to himself. But I can't say that if Jesus does something, that was bad phrasing. If Jesus does something, I think it's okay for us to do it. Jason talked this morning that Jesus got angry. It's okay to get angry. That's how you handle it. Jesus wept. It's okay to weep. There are sad things that we can see every single day. Don't believe me? Turn on the news. There are sad things that happen around us. We try to bottle it up. We may not show that emotion. We may be weeping internally in our head or whatever. But it's okay to cry. It's good sometimes. I know I've caught myself sometimes. I just cry for no reason just because I was kind of due. I had bottled it all up, and it was just, I needed to let it out. And Mandy will ask me, "What's wrong?" I'm like, "I don't know. Nothing. I just needed to let it out." And she's like, "Okay." So it is okay to cry. It's okay to cry during good times. It's okay to cry during bad times. So don't ever feel ashamed about showing emotion. one of the neatest things I've seen is when somebody is recounting a story, maybe of their upbringing or their coming to Christ, and it makes them emotional. That shows how developed they are in that, how true their story is, and how deep their feelings are towards that story. So, do we have that same conviction when we are telling others about Christ? Do we have that love? Do we have that drive that we need to have that gives us that much emotion and that much compassion on wanting people to come to meet Jesus, to know Jesus, and to follow what he has done? So yeah, I started this whole lesson just thinking 2 words: Jesus wept. If you need to come and weep, if you need to come and ask prayers, if you need to come and laugh and praise with us, let us know something good that's going on, we're here. We're here all the time. Here's a public way to do it as we offer the invitation. If there's anything that we can do to help you, pray for you, if you need baptism, please come while we stand and sing.